All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the American University and the School of International Service, Rose Shinko, I'm the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education in the School of International Service. I would like to welcome you all to this afternoon's discussion. We are really honored to have partnered with and to be working with this new initiative, Transitional Justice for Iran. They've organized today's discussion in concert with Professor Mokhtari, and we are really thrilled to have you here today. So thank you so much. We're going to begin today with one of the activities that they've been working on. They've designed a video that they have created, an awareness-raising video for Iranians. And they'd like to share that with you today before we begin our discussion. So I will turn it over now to the video, and we will all watch that. Thank you.
عدالت انتقالی برای ایران مجموعه‌ای است مستقل متشکل از گروهی از فعالان جامعه مدنی، پژوهشگران و متخصصان در زمینه‌های حقوق، عدالت انتقالی، مطالعات جنسیت، علوم سیاسی و جامعه شناسی.
این مجموعه در پی ساختن زیربنایی برای گذار جامعه ایران از یک رژیم اقتدارگر و ناقض حقوق بشر به سوی جامعه‌ای دموکراتیک و صلح‌آمیز است.
ما بر این باور هستیم که ارائه تصویری روشن از مفاهیم و رویه‌های عدالت انتقالی و گفتگو درباره آن یک گام مهم و مؤثر در تقویت آرامش و همبستگی میان افراد جامعه است و به مسیر گذار از استبداد به استقرار دموکراسی و احیای باورها و ارزش‌های دموکراتیک در ایران کمک می‌کند.
در این راستا عدالت انتقالی برای ایران در صدد است تا بر اساس چارچوب‌های حقوق بین‌الملل و حقوق بشر و با مطالعه تجربه جوامعی که این مسیر گذار را با موفقیت طی کرده، راه حل‌های متمرکز بر اصل حاکمیت قانون مبتنی بر ظرفیت‌های موجود در ایران پیشنهاد داده و تصویری شفافتر از این مسیر به شهروندان ایرانی ارائه دهد.
اهداف و مقاصد اصلی این مجموعه عبارتند از روشنسازی مفهوم عدالت انتقالی و ارکان و مکانیزم‌های اجرایی مرتبط با آن،
ایجاد شبکه ارتباطی میان پژوهشگران و کنشگران مرتبط با عدالت انتقالی،
مطالعه و بررسی اصول قانونگذاری با تأکید بر ارزش‌های دموکراتیک،
پژوهش و برنامه ریزی برای ترمیم نهادهای حقوقی، سیاسی و قضایی با تأکید بر اصول انقلاب زن، زندگی، آزادی،
بررسی و تقویت مکانیزم‌های قانونی جهت پاسخگو کردن عاملان نقض حقوق بشر،
ایجاد شبکه ارتباطی جهت بهبود فعالیت‌های گروه‌های فعال حقیقت‌یاب،
ایجاد منابع و شبکه‌هایی به منظور حمایت از قربانیان، خانواده‌های آنها و سایر افراد در معرض خطر در ایران
و در نهایت تقویت اعتماد و امید به آینده برای برقراری صلح و گفتگو میان گروه‌های اجتماعی مختلف.
All right, I'm back again. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Phil Brenner. He probably doesn't need an introduction. However, he's published widely on the United States and Cuba relations, U.S.-Latin American relations, contemporary U.S. foreign policy, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. His most recent book is Cuba Libre, a 500-year quest for independence, co-authored with Peter Eisner. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and a really fabulous professor and scholar, Dr. Phil Brenner. And he will moderate the discussion for today.
Thank you, Dean Shinko. It wouldn't seem like I would be the right person to do this, except for the fact that Professor Mokhtari was one of my favorite students when she was an undergraduate at American University. So those of you who were her students now should know that you have a great model to follow. So I'll start by introducing Professor Mokhtari, although you'll speak second, I gather.
Yes.
Well, I'll start with Professor Orenlicher, who is a distinguished professor at the Washington College of Law, American University's Law School. She has done an enormous amount of work on issues of transitional justice and justice. She worked at the State Department as the deputy for war crimes issues from 2009 to 2011. She was United Nations independent expert on combating impunity and special advisor on the High Commissioner on National Minorities, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and her book, Some Kind of Justice, the ICTY's impact on Bosnia and Serbia, is considered the definitive account of the International Criminal Tribunal's work on the former Yugoslavia. Professor Mokhtari teaches, as most of you know, in the School of International Service, where she focuses on the politics of human rights, political change in the Middle East, and political Islam. Her book, After Abu Ghraib, Exploring Human Rights in America and the Middle East, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2009 and won the American Political Science Association's Human Rights Section Award as the best book of the year. Her more recent research has focused on human rights dynamics of protest movements, quite appropriate now, and transitions in the Middle East. As you all know, this is a very timely topic. I'm glad to see so many of you are here because this is an important issue, and we're looking forward to learning a lot more. Let's begin with Professor Orenlicher. Please help me pronounce your name. You're muted, I think.
Muted.
I can't. Great, thank you. Sorry, I was trying to gesture that I can't unmute myself. Orenlicher, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Brenner, for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to thank my colleagues at SIS and Transitional Justice for Iran for organizing this event, addressing such a deeply important topic, and also for inviting me to participate. I'm very sorry I can't do so in person, but I've managed to come down with the bug. It's a tribute to how high my regard is for this program that I'm appearing remotely right now. I hope you understand it that way. With so many others around the world, I've been deeply moved and inspired by the courage of so many of Iran's women and other citizens, which they've shown in the face of really a merciless and unrelenting attack on their fundamental rights, particularly since, but long before the tragic death of Mahsa Amini in September. I want to be clear, I'm not an expert on Iran, and will just offer some very general reflections on experiences from the transitional justice field in general. But I'm delighted that I have as a colleague on this program somebody who is very steeped in expertise in Iran, Shadi Mokhtari. I'm going to count on her to draw links between the general points I make and the specific experience of Iran. So first, I thought it would be useful to very briefly, for those of you not familiar with the field, to say a few words about what transitional justice is. I think many people participating in this program have a sense of it. There's no general, widely accepted definition, but the term is come to refer to a host of measures that states and increasingly other actors have taken to address in myriad levels, a legacy of terrible atrocities committed on a mass basis. And I'll come back to what those measures look like in a minute. Just a little bit more on what transitional justice is. Many attribute its roots to the post-war prosecutions in Nuremberg and Tokyo and elsewhere, but transitional justice really emerged as a field of practice in the 1980s, particularly, but not exclusively, in Latin America, as numerous countries began to emerge from prolonged periods of military dictatorship that were characterized by horrific atrocities. And these dictatorships gave way to restored democracies. And those new democratic governments were faced with an agonizing dilemma, which was, what do we do with this horrific legacy? It didn't just vanish with the inauguration of a democratic government, but we are faced now with the legacies, with open wounds of harrowing abuses among our citizens, a deformed judiciary, and we face these legacies in a context where those responsible for the atrocities didn't just go away. They didn't just vanish. They're still very much present in a society. And even though they're no longer in official power, they're present in a way that presents an ongoing threat to the further progress of a society away from a period of dictatorship. So as my observations suggest, from the very outset of the field, transitional justice has been very much defined by dilemmas. And it's impossible to talk about transitional justice without talking about the dilemmas that constrain choices and help shape the options that actors confront as they try to address a legacy of horrific abuses. It's also probably important to recognize that the field of transitional justice, and I say this because this program is described as one that is hoping to identify lessons learned. It's a field that is very self-critical, and it's marked by robust debate. And with that, and that's been very helpful and salutary. What we've seen since the field first began to emerge over 30 years ago is a continuous effort to learn lessons from the past, including to learn lessons from mistakes and to undertake course correction. And so almost everything that one says about lessons learned takes place in a context of acknowledging some paths that were taken that may not have been worth emulating in other contexts. So let me just give you an example of that, just to give you a flavor of it. When the field first emerged, there was a tendency to emphasize and focus overwhelmingly on criminal prosecutions, which a lot of people treated as the capstone of transitional justice. And I wrote a lot about criminal prosecutions. I want to be clear that when I'm being self-critical about the field, I'm including myself in that. But before long, it was abundantly clear that a society that has just experienced a period of horrific violence, which has a debilitating effect at myriad levels, culture, institutional habits of respect for fellow citizens, a society emerging from that really needed to undertake multiple interventions. And to be clear, by no means solely in the space of transitional justice, but also in the space of transitional justice. And so common interventions that we started to see in many countries included, in addition to prosecutions, efforts to uncover the truth about what really happened during a dictatorship, both factually, but also at a level of understanding. Why did this happen? What patterns, systems, structures, attitudes enabled atrocities to take place in a country on a mass scale? Second type set of measures involved reparations for victims, which is the type of transitional justice measure that is most directly concerned with victims themselves, although hopefully all of the different measures redound to the benefit of victims. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Another category is called, the jargon for this category is guarantees of non-recurrence, but it really means a host of measures aimed at preventing a recurrence of the kind of atrocities, as well as other human rights violations that the country saw take place in the past. Initially, this set of measures focused on institutional reforms, some of which would be obvious, like reforming security services that played a key role in repression, abolishing particularly abusive security forces, undertaking judicial reform to tighten the protection of rights in the legal system, and so forth. As the field has progressed and learned more, we've come to understand that while institutional reform is really important, guarantees of non-recurrence have to take place at every level of society, including, very importantly, at the level of culture. You have to, as I've alluded to earlier, address a culture of disrespect for human rights and all that entails. And the sphere of culture, education, art has become increasingly important in guarantees of non-recurrence. To the extent the field recognized that interventions have to take place in multiple spheres, not just in the sort of high-profile trials that many of us are familiar with, that was a positive development in its own right. But one of the not so positive developments was that those different what are sometimes called pillars of transitional justice, reparations, non-recurrence, et cetera, those pillars became somewhat formalistic, and there was a tendency almost for the international community, for international actors like UN human rights experts, to sort of almost develop a checklist. If you are undertaking a project of transitional justice, here's the template. And that template didn't translate well from one country to another. The kinds of prosecutions that may have been very effective in one context just didn't work very well in a country where the judicial system had been ravaged by prolonged conflict, for example. And so fortunately, fairly early on, we came to understand, not just at the level of rhetoric, but truly deeply, that there's no one size fits all approach to transitional justice. There are, in fact, myriad downsides to trying to mimic what another country did, as though it discovered the magic formula. That doesn't mean that experiences from other countries are unimportant. In fact, one of the important lessons learned from experience in this field is that for a society that is newly confronting the question, what should we do in our transitional justice initiatives? It's important, valuable for them to learn from the experiences of others, both in a positive and negative sense, both to learn what the pitfalls might be of certain approaches, what mistakes were made, but also to draw inspiration from other countries' experiences. I don't want to spend a whole lot more time laying out some of the important lessons learned before Professor Mokhtari speaks, but let me just end this part of my comments with a few further reflections. So one really reflects one of the most important lessons learned from my perspective, from our experience in transitional justice. And that relates to keeping sight of what your goals are. Now, earlier I indicated that during a certain period in the field, and to some extent still, there was a tendency to sort of lead with institutions, lead with trials, lead with reparations programs, and maybe lose sight of what you're trying to achieve. And so one takeaway that's proven to be super important is that you need to keep sight on your goals. What are you trying to achieve? And tailor the measures that you try to adopt to those goals rather than letting the institutions themselves take over. Because if you start with institutions, you may lose sight of what you're trying to achieve, and you may design institutions that in fact may set back the achievement of your goals. Let me say just a little bit about goals in general, but it obviously follows from what I've said that I think it's important for citizens of a country that are striving to protect its future and address the victims of past abuses. It's for them to identify their priorities and goals. But let me say this: in general, transitional justice has two broad sets of goals. One is a forward-looking set of goals, broadly to take measures that, among other things, will help move a country away from a terrible past to an increasingly rights-respecting society. And so again, that takes a whole host of interventions, but there's this broad set of forward-looking goals. You're trying to make the transition in transitional justice actually happen. And you're trying to help midwife a transition in which rights will be reliably protected and where there won't be the kind of backlash and setback that returns you to a state of pervasive human rights violations. And that's a really big, huge task. But the other broad focus of transitional justice measures, very appropriately, is to provide redress for victims. And I would say that I think the experience we've had over 30 years in many, many countries now has shed a lot of light on the kinds of measures that can be meaningful for victims. And so keeping sight of that as a priority and as a driver for programs is so important. Related to that, and also I can't say more about how important this is to strive for inclusive justice among victims. I say this because in many societies, and I'm not an expert on Iran, but I suspect this is true for Iran, there are many different categories. In fact, I'm sure this is true for Iran, many different categories of victims across different classes, across different groups, and across time. Abuses have happened in waves in Iran. And when there's an opportunity to address those abuses, there will be a lot of different sectors of victims who want to be recognized. As you look toward the future, this is the time to be inclusive and to structure planning in a way that already instantiates the values that one hopes will be reflected in a future government of Iran. And by that, I mean a value of deep regard and equal regard for every human being. So inclusive consultations with a wide category of victims with a view to including them in a future program of justice is very important. And I guess the last thing I would say, and perhaps I've already alluded to this, is that the way you go about planning a transitional justice program is already part of the process of social reconstruction. The way that human rights coalitions treat each other within the planning phase can already be part of a profoundly important culture shift in respect for human rights. So again, I think one of the most important takeaways from long experience now is that there should be broad consultations among relevant actors, including in particular victims. And broad has to mean inclusive participation of all victims. So I'm going to stop here for now, but look forward to hearing what my colleague has to say and to commenting a bit more later.
Thank you so much. This was an extraordinary lesson for all of us. I hope that when this is broadcast and recorded, people will use this. This is a template for action and an extraordinary guide. So thank you so much. Professor Makhtari is going to focus immediately on Iran, what's going on today.
Okay. First of all, thank you. What an honor to be here sitting next to Diane Orentlicher and Phil Brenner. And thank you all for coming, guests from outside of the university, and of course, my students who were required to be here. Actually, I am also, let me do my qualifications and say that I am not an expert on transitional justice, and transitional justice is not really a part of my research, but I do focus on human rights, and transitional justice as a subfield of human rights is something that I am broadly familiar with. And when I was approached by Transitional Justice for Iran and its group members, I sensed that they wanted to do what I see Iranians around me, right now want, which is to mobilize to do something. I mean, the protests in Iran were so inspirational for many of us. And also a call to action, right? Because what the protests did, and I'll maybe say a little bit more about this later, is, before, what was it, September? I forget if it was September 16th or whatever the first day in mid-September was that these protests began, I can say that most Iranians could not imagine a post-Islamic republic in the current shape and form it takes future, right? It was kind of a dream out there. And it is not to say that we're there at all by any means, but at least these protests, I think, lifted, excuse the pun here, but lifted the veil or a cloak on the level of dissatisfaction amongst a significant sector of the Iranian population or segment of the population. And has, it's a call to action for all of us to be thinking about these issues. So what I want to do in this round, and these are going to be a little bit longer comments, and then I will make, I promise, second round when I speak much briefer comments. But I want to talk about two things. The ways that I think Iran is, Iranian activists and Iranians are well positioned for a transitional justice process, which we hope will take place and which I will argue is, in a sense, already underway. And on the other side, some of the potential challenges and pitfalls. So let me, in starting us off with the ways that I think Iranians, both in the diaspora and those, amongst the protesters in Iran, are well positioned and have set us up for a successful transitional justice process, whatever shape or form that may take. Let me just say, or really reiterate, and this came up in the conversation that we had yesterday with Professor Orentlicher about goals and keeping your eye on the goals. And this was, I think, a point she made that really resonated with me, in the sense that if sometimes those pursuing transitional justice get caught up in the process rather than the objectives. So she laid out the primary objectives. I would say, just to reiterate quickly, broadly, transitional justice has the aim to transcend a dark period or legacy of mass human rights violations by recognizing and confronting them in some manner. So it encompasses an element of truth-telling. It seeks to put forth some kind of authoritative, truth about the human rights violations of the past, and to kind of set the stage for a very different future. And by authoritative truth, what we really mean is a truth that most people within that society will latch onto and be able to accept. Transitional justice seeks to repair victims or survivors. It seeks to promote the rule of law and establish that human rights violations will no longer be faced with impunity or tolerated with impunity. It seeks to promote both human rights norms and societal commitments to these norms through the process. As a society that has experienced mass human rights violations is entering what is hopefully a very different era in which human rights are widely respected and upheld. And it also, particularly in its restorative form, right, aims to promote national reconciliation through acknowledging the crimes of the past. So increasingly, as was mentioned, transitional justice formulations are recognizing, marginalized groups, right, within transition. I mean, there's all sorts of very interesting innovations in transitional justice. One of the cases that I think is very fascinating is the Colombian case right now that has some of the most kind of progressive experimentation with transitional justice, where you have, provisions that are geared towards acknowledging the suffering of women and the suffering of indigenous populations on top of, the suffering that the broader population experienced. So, transitional justice, as you know, and I just want to kind of reiterate this point, started out much more retributive in the sense of we need to prosecute. We need to take the people who are responsible to these human rights violations before courts, and, where they can be sanctioned, material sanctions, where they can go to jail, there can be a judgment against them. And then we also have restorative justice approaches, which aim more to, in addition to having some, truth-telling and accounting of the past and elements of accountability for perpetrators, but also have this objective of reconciling different sectors of society. Okay, so, a lot of my students in my post-revolutionary Iran class were also in my justice, ethics, and human rights class, and we looked at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is, obviously one of the most well-known. So just to say that I think probably the case in a lot of contexts, but particularly amongst Iranians, when they think of transitional justice, there is much more of an emphasis on prosecution's retributive justice, and the organizing that I've seen and what activists have been doing is definitely that's the focus. And I really don't know anyone who is working on the restorative or even, considering reparations. And again, this isn't, most transitional justice processes are not just one or the other, but some combination of the two. Okay, I just wanted to say that as a springboard to now, again, what I think is in line with the objectives of transitional justice that's coming out of Iran. So first, I would just start with the ethos of the slogans of this protest movement. I think it, obviously there's contradictions, but by and large, the overwhelming kind of ethos of both the slogans and, what would in the literature is called the repertoires of contention, basically what, the different practices that people are engaging in to show their dissent or to resist. Let's start with the animating slogan, woman, life, liberty. I think it aligns with transitional justice objectives in many different ways and human rights principles in many ways. The woman in the slogan, when chanted by men, in protests that are led by women, and men are repeating the chant, to me represents a deep acknowledgement, even a sort of repentance for the immense injustice and discrimination that women have endured, all these years. And while women life freedom can mean very different things to those who are invoking it, and I'll say just broadly what I mean by that is that sometimes I have been stunned over the course of this period to see people invoking woman life, liberty, and then following with very misogynist attacks, and even threats of sexual violence against people that they disagree with, but in the name of promoting woman life, liberty. But then I think the slogan in and of itself allows for challenges to that kind of contradictory use, and I've been seeing many examples of that as well. So when you do use very misogynistic, attacks, being confronted with, why are you chanting woman life, freedom, and using this language? So in a sense, we could say that as people are participating in what many are calling a woman life freedom revolution, or this movement, they are, in a sense, learning and acting more in line with these norms and these principles. And so the slogan in and of itself, I think, represents leaps and bounds in the kind of gender consciousness that's necessary for gender equality, not just in Iran, but I think in a lot of places. I think that if it persists along this path, the Iranian case can really contribute positively to gender equality beyond Iran. As a direct challenge to injustices that women have endured, the slogan also, I think, represents a broader commitment to justice. And women and life taken together represent at their heart, a commitment, I think, to nonviolence. And of course, liberty is, a key underlying principle of the human rights paradigm. There are other slogans that I think really align with transitional justice goals, and I'm just trying to keep up with my list of slogans. There's so many, and it's evolving. But so, in hamisal janayat mag barin velayat. I almost want to get up and, but in any case, all these years of crimes, death, and there's a lot, I'm sure there can be articles written about that death to formulation, but death to this guardianship, which is also sometimes translated as down with this guardianship. And guardianship is a reference to the thesis of the rule of the jurisconsult, or the guardianship of the jurisconsult clerical class. Another early on was Narusari, Natusari, Azadi, or Barobari. So this is in reference to early post-revolution challenges to mandatory veiling, where the government basically said, either you veil or we will, slap you in the head. I don't know how you translate Tusari, or you get hit in the head. And it rhymes in Farsi. And so they're saying neither mandatory veiling nor getting slapped in the head. We want freedom and equality. Others, let's see. Ghaziyamun qatilan kull nizam batile. So our judges are killers, and the entire regime is invalid. So you can see some of these transitional justice themes just in the slogans. I don't want to kind of belabor the point too much. So there's also already all sorts of memorializing, I think, of the human rights violations of the past. So it's very interesting to see, the parents of victims of previous waves of repression in 2009 and 2019 attending the funerals of, those who've been killed in this wave of protests. You also have kind of tremendously powerful artistic productions. in the form of graphic art, graffiti art, and performances, some of which was featured at the end of the video that we had from Transitional Justice in Iran. And of course, music, and one particular, many, many very powerful pieces, but one that really has had an impact. So I would say, by and large, the slogans and these artistic productions embody hope and an ability to reimagine and kind of a desire to reconstruct their society in a way that upholds rights and human dignity, and the principles of equality and justice, kind of a sense that there's an underlying hope that they can build their society on better and drastically different values. There are, of course, exceptions to this and contradictions. Now, that's also, and if anyone can get me a tissue, I would really appreciate if anyone has a tissue. There are also incredible kind of acts and expressions of solidarity amongst, along the lines where there were all sorts of divisions in the past. And so this includes class lines, this includes, ethnic identities. What else did I have in my note here? And gender, obviously, right? Excuse me. And I don't want to say that there is no discrimination left. I'm just saying that there were some very interesting kind of inroads that have been made through these expressions of solidarity amongst these disparate groups within society. At the same time, so that's all happening in Iran. The Iranian diaspora is also doing quite a bit in terms of, I think, actions that, serve and are in the path of transitional justice. So they have, for some time, for a long time, actually, for many years, there have been diaspora-based human rights activists, some of them, Iranian exiles, some of them who've been here for a longer time, that have been engaged in, documenting human rights violations. Some have been mastering the ins and outs of UN processes and diffusing human rights language through mostly kind of these foreign-based media sources. Some have been forging various ties inside the country. Many have been involved in forms of retributive justice and have been trying to pursue prosecutions wherever they can. Petitions to the ICC, petitions to domestic courts in mostly European countries. And then, of course, there have been two that I know of, people's tribunals held, very elaborate proceedings where there are international judges, there's a prosecutor, there is considerable evidence that's presented, and then there's a judgment that essentially finds the Iranian government guilty of the crimes. And this was done in relation to the 1988 mass killings, and then again the more recent 2019 killings. So I would say that many activists in the diaspora have become fluent kind of in the human rights discourses and processes that have considerable overlap with transitional justice. And not only that they've become fluent, but I would say that, they have really pushed the bounds and have shaken up the human rights system in what has transpired just since the protests. So there were two very unprecedented actions that at first these activists were told would not be possible, and they made it happen. So one was having the Human Rights Council at the UN, which is known to be a fairly dysfunctional body, this is something we talk about in class, to create a fact-finding mission, committee for the human rights violations committed by Iran. And usually these fact-finding committees are for cases where there are armed conflict. So this was unprecedented in that sense. And then they were able to get Iran removed from the Commission on the Status of Women. And I don't want to take us too far away from our transitional justice discussion, but I just wanted to note that they're not just following human rights prescriptions. They are shaking things up in ways that are very interesting. Okay, so now I want to turn to kind of the flip side of what I see the challenges are for anyone who is interested in working on transitional justice in Iran. And this is where I want to bring in some of my current research, which was, I'm going to read you a few excerpts from my research, which was about, drawn from my work in Egypt, but I'm now adapting also to bring in an Iranian case study. So I would say that there was a tremendous amount of moral clarity that Iranians felt when those images of women, in particular women, but of course men and women, raising their fists in defiance in those protests. I mean, they were very iconic images and videos that come out that you basically forces you to acknowledge that there is a grave injustice that someone here is standing up against. But that moral clarity that Iranians felt, and that also others around the world felt at that moment, can slip away, and we can end up with what I call what I call the moral maze in my research. And so here's where maybe I'll go faster if I read here. And I do promise my next set of comments will be shorter. What is the moral maze? So in the experience of human rights as a moral maze, ordinary people are bombarded by a flurry of human rights claims and counterclaims, many of which are strategically deployed by powerful actors to muddy the waters, but are not readily identifiable as such, fragmenting popular dispositions towards human rights claims. Part of the population adopt partisan human rights stances, while others find the muddled terrain produced by a whirlwind of accounts of human rights violations, and then the challenges to the credibility and sincerity of those accounts, or the activists posing those challenges, too difficult to adjudicate. Right? So there is just so much contestation, and there are so many accusations of political agendas behind human rights claims, and that actor is really an agent of this political persuasion or that. And so it creates this maze that is very hard for people to maneuver. And in many ways, it is, states are responsible for kind of intentionally sowing doubt. And this comes from Lisa Wadeen's work that I use on Syria and these dynamics in the Syrian context. So there are actual human rights violations, but there's also all sorts of what people now increasingly understand as fake news, doctored images, and so those very legitimate human rights violations sometimes drown in a sea of contestation. So in this practice, human rights becomes an amalgamation of accounts of actual abuses, fabricated, exaggerated, or sensationalist human rights claims, constructed to influence audiences for a range of political ends, as well as efforts to highlight and conflate the political agendas and moral contradictions of politicized deployments with more legitimate human rights claims. Okay, and I'm not going to read too much more from my own, but there's a lot, I think, that applies to the case in Iran. Let me just say, if I were to break it down, there's disinformation and misinformation of the digital age that we all have to deal with in all sorts of contexts. The fake social media accounts, the bots, the electronic trolling committees that can distort or cast doubt on again, whether a certain human rights claim or an activist is legitimate or not. And interestingly, I see Iranians are very aware of that, right? So that's good that they are aware of, they're constantly worried about, that's a cyberi, that's a bot, right? But what does that do? That also increases the level of distrust of everyone around, right? But that's not all that happens. They are also more careful increasingly about their sources. There's also both very, compelling, legitimate human rights claims and the more politicized and problematic ones. Human rights can often serve as a tool of political agendas, and then there's polarization. So human rights discourses can quickly evolve to fuel polarization, accompanied by othering and dehumanization. What do I mean about this? So in the Iranian case, as in Tunisia and Egypt that I've looked at very closely in recent years, there is a deep secular Islamist divide. And they're essentializing categories of the human rights framework also do not help, because when traditional human rights formulations, we have a perpetrator, we have the victim, and the violation, and that category of perpetrator can sometimes be broadened, right? So it's not just, and I'm seeing this in the Iranian case, so it's not just the people with blood on their hands, right? It's also their supporters, or it's even also people who fail to speak out against the regime. They also kind of get targeted and shamed. So the essentializing, the categories of human rights framework, and also calls for vengeance against regime supporters. And of course, this is problematic because, in transitional justice formulations, as was mentioned, essentially, even if you are able to do some successful prosecutions, there's no way you can prosecute everyone responsible for crimes, or it's very unlikely, let me say. And certainly you still have a large segment of your population who is essentially, supported this regime. You have, I think, maybe 20% is not that off of a percentage of people who supported the regime. And so using human rights discourses broadly contributes to the polarization when applied to these people. I'll try to kind of wrap this all up. I think in terms of lessons for politicization of these processes, Tunisia is a great example to look at, because there was a huge transitional justice, primarily restorative justice effort, but it was pretty successfully labeled as something to the benefit of Islamists, which under the Ben Ali regime were, most of the victims were Islamists. And then there was a lot of politics around reparations, and it delegitimized the whole process. So, essentially, these dynamics, essentially, transitional justice does not take place in a vacuum from the politics around it, right? And as much as your credibility is bound to perceptions of being viewed as impartial, right? You still have to maneuver, the politics around you and the moral maze. And so, contributing to depolarization and depoliticization, at least of your own work, is essential. I have other points, but I'm going to stop there. I know I went very long. Excuse me.
But what you did is raise a lot of questions that I think people will want to ask.
I will.
Professor Orentlicker, you're going to give us some sense now of how to think about transitional justice when there is no transition. Is that right?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. That's a tough one, and it's tough, obviously, but also because one thing we know from experience is that the way a regime ends also affects the landscape of possibility. And so that's something that political scientists have talked about for a really long time, that there's a wider scope for possible options when a regime has collapsed of its own weight and no longer has any substantial level of political power. There's a wider range in those circumstances than when there's a negotiated transition. And we don't know what the process is ahead. But there's some things that you can do anyway. And we've already been talking about some of them. I think both Shadi and I have emphasized the importance of being really mindful of what your message is. What are the values that you're conveying? What are you projecting as the nature of the future Iran that you want to have? And be aware of the consequences of that framing. There's a number of other things that you can do in the meantime. So first of all, obviously, the big work is not the work of transitional justice. It's the work of political change, and it's the work of human rights mobilization in general, right? So it's not that things are mostly on hold. That's the essential task, and it's not the task of transitional justice itself. But how do you prepare for transitional justice during this period? There's some things that you can do that are worth doing right now. One is attending to the urgent needs of victims to the extent that you can. And so in a number of contexts like Syria, there's a fair amount of experience already in how to provide urgent care to survivors of atrocities, particularly those that are accessible because they're in a refugee situation. But also there's unfortunately a lot of experience in finding ways to attend to the needs of victims, even in a context of ongoing violence. So that's part of the Transitional Justice Project. As I said earlier, one of the most important goals of transitional justice is to provide redress for victims in ways that address their needs as they see them, as they experience them, and their needs are going to change over time. But typically, urgent needs include attending to physical care, psychological care, and then once survivors attend to those kind of urgent needs, they very soon have placed a lot of priority on social and economic integration. Experiencing violence impacts victims in a lot of ways, including loss of their means of their job, their career. It's impacted by being detained in prison, right? And so once the urgent physical, psychological care needs are met, there's a host of other needs that often don't get attention but rise to priorities, the priority level for survivors. And often it's really after those first and second level needs are met that survivors start to focus on the kind of justice mechanisms that we associate with transitional justice. So attending to the extent possible to the current needs of survivors is really important. And we'll also set a foundation for them, including them in conversations about what form of transitional justice is going to be important to them. They're also in the sort of space of institutional reform, there's a lot that can be done now and probably is being done right now, which includes taking an inventory of existing legal structures, targeting those that are in urgent need of reform, mapping out what kinds of legal reforms you want to advance as soon as it's possible to change repressive laws and guarantee space. One of the issues that is very salient for Iran, but also is unfortunately relevant for many countries that aren't in the kind of human rights crisis Iran is that there's a closing space for civil society. And one of the things we know from experience is that civil society plays an essential role in opening the space for transitional justice, in defining its terms, ensuring its success. And if you don't guarantee that space, it's just going to be so much harder for civil society to play a constructive role, and frankly, just to enjoy the freedoms that they need to. So as part of the inventorying of laws that can and should be underway, already looking at ways to protect that space for civil society should be part of it, in addition to some of the more obvious reforms that may be underway. We've already talked about learning lessons from the experience elsewhere. Professor Mokhtari mentioned the experience in Tunisia as one example that is worth studying. And this is a good time to start to educate oneself about, and I'm sure that's also going on, about experiences elsewhere with a view to trying to be ready to avoid some mistakes and pitfalls that others have encountered. Documenting, I know that's already underway, but capturing information in real time in a reliable way is important and will be useful for subsequent efforts at justice, but may also be relevant for relatively contemporaneous justice initiatives in other situations, like in Syria, where it hasn't been possible to find justice at home because there hasn't been a transition. Activists have been able to bring prosecutions or get prosecutors to undertake prosecutions in other countries pursuant to the legal principle of universal jurisdiction. And there's been a really impressive amount of very serious prosecutions underway in European countries, for example, as a result of the efforts of Syrians in the diaspora, bringing cases against perpetrators. You need a perpetrator in order to do that. So that's one challenge, but that's a way to not to have to wait for justice when it's possible to find somebody who merits prosecution and it's possible to assert jurisdiction over them. Those kinds of prosecutions also can have a knock-on effect and bring further pressure to bear in the country that's responsible for atrocities to do something about it. Leaders are aware when their colleagues have been prosecuted in other countries, and they think about the consequences of that. And so that's one thing. And if I could just shift and away from the sort of things that you can do and the steps that you can do, I also want to just return to the theme of lessons learned, and here, kind of in the negative lessons, things to be wary of. This is going to be sound so obvious that it may go without saying, but I say it because I've seen how important it becomes in practice on the ground in many countries. It's really important to know the limits of transitional justice, both in general and with respect to specific mechanisms, and not overpromise what transitional justice can deliver, and also understand how transitional justice efforts link up with other processes that have to take place, like economic reconstruction, development, programming in a country whose economy has been very much impacted by the abuses and misgovernance and other ways of a regime. So to make that more concrete, one thing I've seen happen time and again is many survivors of atrocious crimes who once placed very high hopes in transitional justice and devoted themselves to bringing about prosecutions end up being very critical of what transitional justice accomplished because the economy didn't improve, or reconciliation didn't magically happen because there were some prosecutions. And I wish I could remember her exact words, but I remember one Serbian activist I interviewed for my book who had worked very hard to support the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal because she thought it would help stimulate a reckoning among Serbians for their role in the Yugoslav conflicts. She described her disappointment, but more than disappointment, her growing understanding that trials can't do everything. And she said something to the effect, we initially thought the ICTY would do everything. We thought that it would bring justice. We thought it would prosecute everyone. We thought it would bring about reconciliation. We thought it would be reconciliation. And her point was, we should have known that trials can't do everything like that. But often expectations are raised so much that inevitably there's disappointment and also a failure to focus on other measures that have to happen simultaneous to transitional justice mechanisms. Kind of related to the point about not knowing the limits of transitional justice in general and with respect to specific mechanisms is just being aware that there's no perfect program. You can't undo the harms that give rise to transitional justice. You can't bring back those who should never have been killed, never should have been tortured. You can't bring them back. And there's no kind of justice that can do all of that. But if you're realistic about what it can do and how it can respond to victims' expressed needs, then it can be successful in meeting those needs. And I would say, just as a kind of concrete example of knowing the limits of transitional justice mechanisms, and Professor Mokhtari touched on this earlier, I worry a lot when I see leaders and others set as a goal prosecuting everyone who is responsible for abuses. And Professor Mokhtari already articulated why that's setting yourself up for problems down the road. But I see it happen very often, and I see it happening constantly today when I hear of the very righteous and very just efforts of Ukrainian prosecutors to bring to justice everyone who committed an atrocity in Ukraine. We're going to find that that's not possible. So we have to not overpromise and be strategic about what we can accomplish. Be strategic, keep in mind, again, the end goals of transitional justice, what would be a just set of prosecutions, form of reparations, et cetera, within the constraints that operate. And how will a program of prosecutions impact the people that Professor Mokhtari mentioned earlier, the moderates who you may need as your allies in the future? So to be strategic as well as realistic. Finally, I would say, kind of in the same vein of sort of not overpromising, the flip side of that is being open to creativity. One of the downsides of the sort of template approach that emerged for a while in the field of transitional justice, or the checklist approach, where you do prosecutions check, reparations check, we did that, is that it inhibited the kind of creativity that often leads to the best strategy and approach for that moment in that place. And again, Professor Mokhtari gave a great example of the Truth Commission in 2012 in London, followed by a People's Tribunal in The Hague to deal with terrible crimes of 1988, I believe. And that emerged out of the needs and the demands of victims, and I gather was a very, not just a creative approach, but one that met their needs because it grew out of their expressed mobilization. So be open to creating your own justice, having, sort of been informed of what others have done, but then be open to making your own form of justice. And in fact, I would say that that's one of the great things that the Colombian government and society have modeled already. They really learned a lot about what's been done elsewhere. They went through an enormous process of educating themselves about experiences elsewhere, and then said, and we're going to do what's right for us informed by all that, we're going to make our own justice. And in a sense, the rest of the world will look to us in the future as a model, because we're going to do it in a way that hasn't been done before, but that's right for us. And we are all looking at that model right now.
Professor McMurray?
Yeah, and actually where you just ended up, Diane, is where I was going to, we didn't coordinate this part at all, but I was going to say exactly the same thing, in the sense that I think Iranians have shown an immense amount of imagination and creativity in terms of thinking of what's possible in human rights realms. And there is a lot of, there's a lot of areas of transitional justice that are contested. There's a lot of critiques. And so to not feel compelled to follow everything, that's been done in the past, but to imagine a transitional justice that is more effective than past attempts, and to have this Iranian contribution to transitional justice that we can sit and talk about in a few years, I hope, on another panel, just as we talk about Colombia. I'm just going to make this very short. I noticed some of my students I had said can leave when class time is over, and they took me up on it. Thank you to the students who stayed. Just 3 quick points. One is, again, this theme that was just reiterated, finding the right balance between principle and pragmatism, right? And what we started the conversation with, and Professor Orentlinker mentioned at the very beginning of her talk, in the sense of dilemmas. So one of the biggest dilemmas is right now, how do we talk about and think about transitional justice when we still have the regime in place, and when people who are in power who think that they may be prosecuted if they relinquish power, how that impacts their decision to fight to the end or to negotiate, right? So that's always a consideration when you're talking about transitional justice without a transition. And the Yemeni case is one where there were, one of the biggest demands of the protesters was prosecution and justice, and in the end, they had to, take a deal that gave immunity to Ali Abdullah Saleh. The other thing I would say is trauma, right? Not just, immense amount of trauma for victims' families, but societies, Iran and the broader Middle East. And so, one of the things that transitional justice advocates can start thinking about, and maybe even working on, is the trauma within our societies from these experiences of oppression. And yeah, I will leave it there. Let's see what the audience has to say.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions, but if I could start with 2 questions. One, I want to highlight one of the points that both of you have made about the importance of transparency and civil society. Because one of the things I do is actually on the board of directors of the Washington Office on Latin America, which is much concerned about human rights. And one of the issues that we focus on is the way in which civil society gets undermined, the way in which authoritarianism gets bred by breaking down civil society, particularly around the media. And so one of the things to focus on is how you can strengthen an independent media. But this raises the second question about the United States' role in this. Because the United States, here we sit in Washington, has policies that can contribute to transitional justice or can undermine it. For example, in the case of Cuba, I would say, there are human rights violations that occur because Cuba feels under pressure from the United States. And I would say in Iran, the pressure from the United States contributes to a justification for repression in that case. So the question is, should the United States continue its aggressive policy towards Iran? Does that help transitional justice or not? And then the second part of that is the United States funds groups that are in favor of transitional justice, but it favors some groups and not others. It doesn't favor necessarily groups that would be contrary to some of U.S. foreign policy interests. And so that tends to undermine the legitimacy of groups, even if their goals are worthwhile. And how do we deal with that?
Well, I have a lot to say here, but I know, Diane, that you were not feeling well. And so how about we direct any questions to you, or if you want to say anything about that question in case you need to slip out, or are you okay? I don't know how you're.
Oh, thank you so much. To be truthfully, I'm fading fast. I can't even talk coherently. So I think I am going to have to excuse myself, but you're in excellent hands. And I hope that I can see the recording later, because I'd love to hear your response to that great and important question. Thank you, and apologies for leaving early.
Very great contributions.
Thank you. Okay. So Professor Brenner, this is something I am writing a very long essay about right now. And hopefully we'll be able to share with others soon. But so the Iranian Revolution, as a result of Iranians' historical experiences with outside forces intervening. Oh, okay. Let's see. Is this better? Maybe this is the part that they shouldn't hear. Just kidding.
What's the problem?
They said that they couldn't hear. So if someone in the audience can, or Zoom audience can let us know that you can now hear, that would be helpful. Okay. I will assume that they can hear us. And you know what? It might be the other microphone. Oh, let's see. Okay, I'll have both. All right. So this is something that I've been giving a lot of thought to, because Iranians, one of the key unifying sentiments of the revolution was anti-imperialist sentiment and a lot of anger towards the United States and its policies, and particularly the 1953 coup. And it is very interesting to me that, and I'll just tell you an anecdote. So, when I bring that up, the 1953 coup, with my aunt, I brought it up with her a few weeks ago when I was speaking to her. And she said, Shadi, that's in the past. Okay. Regardless of whether you and I think that's in the past, it sheds light on something. And what I think it is, this gets us into political science. This takes us a little bit, but let me just try to say it in a nutshell, which is the Iranian government's often presenting itself as anti-imperialist has served the purpose of hiding some of the human rights violations that take place in Iran because of the people who have concerns about U.S. imperialism and U.S. influence. And Iranians are immensely angry about that, right? Because for years they've been suffering at the hand of this regime. There have been many human rights violations. And because of their ability to mobilize this anti-imperialist rhetoric, they have been able to they've been able to hide behind it, is I guess what I would say. And that's been a huge problem. And so right now, I think Iranians are mainly concerned with the human rights violations they are directly facing from their government. And I'll leave it there, but there's a lot I have to say about this. But honestly, there is some funding coming from the U.S. government that is, I don't know what it's called in English, Radio Farda, right? So that's media or radio station that's funded by the United States. There's several human rights shows on there that I think do serve a consciousness-raising, purpose. Now, would the United States fund media for Saudi Arabia on this? No, right? And I think that's your point, right? And could we have even had Saudi Arabia removed from the Commission on the Status of Women, right? And so all of that is still at play. But there's also this Iranian, let's stop talking about the U.S. Our main concern is the human rights violations from our regime. So that's in a nutshell.
It raises questions about one of the things being in the United States we can communicate to our own government
Mhm.
about how they can help in the process of transitional justice. Let's hear from the audience. Questions? Oh, there.
Rahana, do you think you can read the questions for us?
Yeah, there's not questions, it was audio issues previously.
Oh, it was the audio issues. Oh yeah, why didn't you?
Yeah, I can't see the message going directly to you.
Oh, okay.
You want to read it?
Yeah. Well, she says she can't see. You cannot see it.
No, I can't see them.
Oh.
It might be on here. Oh, because she's not. Okay. So. Where's this? Can you read this? Let's see. Here's a question. Okay. There you go. Do you want to read it?
Sure.
Here, you can. Well, no, we can't.
Would you please kindly speak about the IRGC and how they can help, they can be eliminated in the process of transitional justice, the process of, given that at least 50% of the country is owned by, it's not clear.
It's not a touch screen.
Agreements with Russia, China, and it
I
doesn't
think I
make
got
sense.
a gist of the question.
Okay.
I mean, the IRGC is a major pillar of power. I mean, this is, I think there would be, any transitional justice process would probably address the IRGC as, or elements within it as perpetrators. And I would love to see a transitional justice process that addresses the human rights violations committed and the atrocities committed in Syria at the auspices of the IRGC. That would be an innovation too, to go outside of the borders. But beyond that, I don't know what else to say. I mean, I know there's a campaign. Well, I'll leave it there.
Questions from the audience here? Sir.
So following up on your question, you mentioned that how transitional justice is possible.
Well, maybe we need.
Thank you so much. So following up on your question, you mentioned that transitional justice is not possible when there is not any transition. So I was thinking that how transitional possible is, so I'm thinking about the case of Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe accepted to step down and relinquish power when there was a guarantee that he wouldn't be prosecuted, if I'm not wrong.
Right.
So don't you think that in some cases, like the case of Iran, when still those who are in power are very powerful, transitional justice is counterproductive, make it impossible to transition?
I'd like to speak to that. So one of the cases we have is Chile, where the process of transition took about 30 years. And during that time, the generals, in particular General Pinochet, was prevented from, the agreement was that they wouldn't be prosecuted. But still there was a transition. And so you can have a very much, as Professor Ortliga said, it depends on the situation in the country, what it's willing to tolerate. But if it takes not prosecuting the criminals, keeping them out of power, but not prosecuting them at least for a time, because ultimately they were prosecuted in Chile, some of them, people have to be patient. And other elements of transitional justice would take place. That's why it's important to distinguish what your goals are. I thought that was a very helpful thing, and not make the only goal prosecution. But it makes a very good point. It could prevent that if you're going to say you're going to go to jail. Why would they give up their power? Exactly.
I mean, that was the point that I was making in relation to Yemen. That was their experience too, where they had to, and these are called pacted transitions. So when you have an agreement, right, with the authoritarian ruler, and contingent on them relinquishing power is that they're not going to be prosecuted. I mean, usually that's what they want. And Pinochet kind of negotiated that along with a lot of other things. Being able to be a senator for life, is it?
Right.
Something to that effect. Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen negotiated that he could still be head of the ruling party.
It might be what
so-
it takes to prevent Trump from running again.
So in any case, yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting parallel there. Yeah, that's part of the, but there's so many other facets to transitional justice than just prosecution. So, you know, and the ICC even takes that into, even if you have an indictment from the ICC, there are special circumstances under which, you know, and some of the special circumstances that are envisioned is a situation like this, precisely that situation, where it can be, you know, the referral to the ICC can be removed.
Other questions? Is there another question here? Please fix the sound.
Oh,
Dear Professor Mokhtari, thank you so much for your thorough insights. Would you please kindly touch on the subject of non-hierarchical digital... No, this thing doesn't let me.
I know,
It's very hard to read the...
let's see.
You can play with it.
Scrolling down is the problem.
Yeah.
Do you want to give it? Did you get it?
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Non-hierarchical digital democracy, as the IRI called the status of opposition unity in the past 4 months. How would you suggest to keep this momentum going, not allowing it to be disrupted by the disagreements on choosing one representative of the people for the transitional period?
I was waiting for that question also. I mean, all I can say is essentially, you know, why are we talking about transitional justice without a transition is back to my initial comment that I think the people who took to the streets in Iran put the ball in our court, you know, forced us to get to the position where we need to start planning and coming up with blueprints for political transition, and, you know, a component of which would be hopefully transitional justice in some shape or form. And so now that's what's being worked out. And so, yes, and I feel like the civil society is farther ahead than the political leadership, right? And that's obviously being negotiated. In terms of, you know, what's happening online, this is a huge issue, right? This is something that creates the moral maze, and the fact that people are aware of the bots and all of the, you know, that the Iranian government has, you know, people who or not even fake accounts that try to create divisions, you know, again, creates a rise in the environment of suspicion. But I must say that I feel like we are moving in a direction where there's somewhat less contentiousness, or at least the contentious, you know, the discussions are more deliberative. There's more reasoned debate than just people using vulgarities against each other online. And so you know, this is something that Syrian activists have had to deal with. You know, how do you maneuver this new era and the digital age and the way authoritarian states have engaged in digital authoritarianism and have, you know, tried to disrupt these processes online? It's a huge question. Yeah.
Any other questions? At least one more. Come on. Yes, gentleman back there.
Thank you so much for the very excellent presentation. You talked about the challenges of the transitional justice, and I just wanted to ask about like the worst case scenario that we hope doesn't happen, but in case there is something that the process fails. What do you recommend, or what do you think like the human rights organizations should base their plans on, or if in the worst case scenario, or if you can talk about like some major factors that you can consider for the when things go not as we are optimistic for? Thank you.
I mean, I'm unfortunately going to probably speak in generalities because I am not a transitional justice expert. But I can tell you the worst case scenario, I think, is when a court or a restorative justice attempt is viewed as political, a tool of politics, and so only it's totally delegitimized in that way, and it's totally ineffective. I mean, also, if you have, people in the government who don't want this to happen. So Tunisia, you have members of the former regime who then rise to power post-transition, and they're not really interested in this being a very successful transitional justice process, and so they undermine it, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that undermine it in Tunisia, unfortunately, but that's one of them. And so that's why I say that, we need to be cognizant of all of these things that could work against a transitional justice process, and to brainstorm about, what are the ways to try and prevent it. Now, transitional justice, again, like I said, doesn't happen in a vacuum, and there are circumstances that are that it can affect, and then there are circumstances that are totally beyond its control, right? Government withdraws funding, right? I mean, all sorts of things can happen, or whatever the funding source is gone. So in the end, all you can do is kind of try to anticipate all the things that can go wrong and try to have some kind of a policy for, being as apolitical. I don't want to say apolitical. What is the word I'm looking for? But not politicized, right? As neutral, right? And viewed as impartial as much as you can. And one of the keys to that is inclusivity, right? As Professor Orentlinker said.